Hello, everybody, and welcome to the fifth episode here of Armchair Admirals. Today, with the topic of the raid on Taranto. And yes, today it's not going to be with Mr. Conway because Mr. Conway is slacking at home, being on vacation, and rather being, away instead of talking to you guys. So today you will have to live with me, but not only with me. Of course, we also have the almighty Taki helping us today with the show. Hello, Taki.
Hello guys, and welcome with the fifth installment. When we started in the June, we wanted to see how it goes, and so far the Armchair Admirals are going strong. So, we are number 5, and this time we are venturing into an area which we didn't visit yet, which is the Mediterranean Sea. So it will be mostly revolving around the British and Italian ships. And to help with that, we have our usual squad of valued guests, and that is the mighty Jingles himself, and
Howdy, folks.
and Drakinifel,
Hello.
with
Yeah,
some very
welcome to
interesting
the stream.
artwork behind you.
Yes, this is the Fleet Air Arm. Well, most of the Fleet Air Arm from World War II.
I think they had more than 5 planes, no?
You
Not-
wouldn't
not
believe it
much more.
sometimes. Certainly, if the RAF had their way. Yeah, you got the Skewer, Seafire, Swordfish, Fulmar, and Barracuda. I could only fit
Yes.
5 planes on there. I know there are others, but these ones were the better ones, I think.
And I'm sorry, Jingles, we had to let people know that you are the owner of a new kitchen.
By the way, how's Akizuki doing?
She's fine. I'm not even sure where she is at the moment. I think she's busy bothering Rita. I've got Juzi in here. She's asleep on top of the cat tree over there.
In any case, so today's topic is, I think, close to both of you because it involves the Royal Navy and it involves some innovative thinking. I think we can quickly jump into our quick recap and tell people basically why we picked this topic and why is it interesting? Why should we care? I think I'll start by asking Mr. Chrysanthos for our first map,
Sure.
because that will illustrate what this whole thing was about. The first map is, in general, the Mediterranean Sea in November 1940 when the raid on Taranto happened, and it has the previous and following battles marked in it. As you can see, the Mediterranean was already quite busy in 1940, ever since Italy joined the war. There was, of course, the adventurous venture into the Egypt, and you can see basically by the position of the front line where the front line was in November 1940. But the big linchpin of Mediterranean is the little blob in the middle, the Malta. Why?
Because from there, we could interdict all of the resupply convoys to Tripoli, resupplying and reinforcing the Italian and German armies. And you can't sink Malta. It's the one aircraft carrier they could never sink. A bit like Midway.
Yeah,
And
but
all-
bigger.
It's also very important for the ships that are operating in the Mediterranean, because if you look at where most of the battles are there, if you divided the Mediterranean into approximate thirds going east to west, you see most of the battles are taking place in that middle third. If a ship were to take heavy damage, whether it be in a surface action or from aircraft, having Malta with a Grand Harbour in Valletta means that those ships don't have anywhere near as far to go to get into harbour and get some at least temporary repairs so that they can go elsewhere, as compared to if they didn't have Malta and you had to potentially go several hundred miles all the way back to Gibraltar or Alexandria, depending on which direction you come from.
And obviously Malta was also a very nice base for the submarines that, again, were very good at interdicting the supply to Tripoli, especially helped by later in the war by the intercepts from Enigma, because a suspicious number of like very important cargo was sunk compared to the regular cargo. Stuff like oil and ammunition and stuff like that. And yeah, the Mediterranean was quite busy from the start of the war, even though there were no like major decisive fleet actions. There still was quite a lot of back and forth, but what was important there was that the Italian Navy was actually fairly strong, which I've seen in the questions for the article. It was quite surprising for a lot of people that basically Italian Navy was a force to be reckoned with. So how did the balance of power stand in the November 1940 in the Mediterranean?
Well, the thing about the Italian fleet, yes, they had some very, very good ships, but they were more. The threat that they posed was more as a fleet in being, in the same way that the Tirpitz, its mere presence, even though it never really did anything other than shell a Norwegian weather station and shoot at some Royal Air Force Lancasters, just its mere presence meant that all of the Arctic convoys had to be escorted by big ships, and that tied them down. And it was the same thing with the Italian Navy. They were hamstrung mostly by a lack of fuel.
Again, the same
fuel,
thing
they
as the
couldn't sail.
Tirpitz.
Yeah, exactly. With no fuel, you couldn't sail. If you couldn't sail, you couldn't train. So having great ships was not much use to the Italians, other than the threat of what if they do sail. Because when they did sail, as events would prove, they didn't do very well because they couldn't sortie for long. And when they did run into combat, they tended to provide a fairly poor account of themselves because they hadn't trained, they hadn't exercised because of the fuel restrictions. They couldn't. The only training they could do was alongside, and there's only so much value you can get out of a harbour trial.
Yeah, and the variable quality of their shell manufacture really didn't help them at all. They had absolutely superb range finding and fire control technology, to the point that in a number of various engagements, the Italian fleet actually outranged and outshot the Royal Navy for accuracy. Obviously not when Warspite took on Giulio Cesare, but outside of that, very often the Royal Navy came away very impressed with how quickly the Italians could establish the range, and then were thoroughly bemused by the fact that the actual accuracy of the individual shells had a spread more akin to, we want to hit something in the next postcode than an actual ship, which was a little bit frustrating for the poor old Italians. I don't know quite if the Italian battleships coming up or the warships are going to have the same kind of historically accurate sigma values, but if they do, that's going to cause a fantastic amount of rage.
We shall see. But yeah, even with all these limiting factors, the Royal Navy just couldn't ignore that the Italian Navy had a squadron of 6 battleships and quite a lot of cruisers at the time of the raid, 9 heavy and 7 light. In Taranto, in the little port right there, down there in the instep of the Italian boot. And in a war, you cannot rely on your enemy not having fuel to sail. You always have to think about them being able to sail and actually do nasty things to you. And to counter that, the Royal Navy had fairly limited forces in the Mediterranean for the most part. And worst of all, large part of these forces were the R-class and the Queen Elizabeth-class battleships, which were not too speedy, so it would be hard for them to actually force an action on the Italian sortie.
Yeah,
sorry, go on.
I was going to say, one of the things you've got to remember is that the Royal Navy had gone into the war with the Marine Nationale, the French Navy, on their side, and it had initially been a war just against Germany. So the Royal Navy had sort of gone, okay, we need to keep a force in the Mediterranean just in case, but we can divert most of our modern and heavy-hitting ships to the North Sea to contain the Kriegsmarine. Then the Italians had shown up a little bit late to the war. The French had obviously dropped out of the war, and now the Royal Navy was left fighting 2 navies on its own, obviously later on with Japan getting involved to be 3, when they thought it was actually going to be 2v1 in their favour, which meant that, as you said, So you had the Revenges, you had the Queen Elizabeth. Some of the Queen Elizabeth's Valiant, Warspite, and Queen Elizabeth herself had been modernized, but the Italians had fully modernized all of their remaining World War I dreadnoughts, which were already fairly quick and were now even faster. And of course, they had Littorio and Vittorio Veneto at this point in time, which were fully modern, fast battleships with a very liberal interpretation of what exactly constituted treaty-era displacement.
The other two things you have to bear in mind is because of the relatively limited number of ships available to the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean, and then the sudden introduction of the Italian fleet, the Royal Navy couldn't split their forces. They could only fight in one place at a time because of the threat posed by anything up to 6 battleships sortying from Italy against them. Plus, look at where Italy is. It's right in the middle of the Mediterranean. And it wasn't really so much, I mean, the Italian Navy was a significant potential threat, but an actual 24 hours a day, 52 weeks a year threat was not just the Italian Air Force, which could cover most of the Mediterranean, certainly the area where most of the major battles were fought, but also the Luftwaffe having the opportunity to base out of those Italian bases as well.
And let's not forget that Italy actually had bases also in the Dodecanese, in the what now are the Greek islands, because they were basically taking care of them under the mandate after the World War One. So the basing potential was very, very strong on basically the entire central third of the Mediterranean, as Mr. Drachinifel already said. And the Royal Navy knew this, and basically every armed force ever prepares hypothetical scenarios of war against basically everyone, right? Because you never know when someone snaps. So actually, already in the in the 1930s, they started toying with the idea of actually they started playing with the idea of attacking Taranto already as early as 1835, but that's a bit out of the scope. But already in 1930s, they started thinking about the possibility of staging a torpedo plane attack on Taranto base.
Yeah,
if I'm not mistaken, Rear Admiral Lister, the guy in overall command of Operation Judgment, was the guy that came up with the original plan for attacking Taranto when they were formulating these what-if plans.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's correct. And the thing is that the Royal Navy, through the interwar period, had actually planned this whole idea of attacking the enemy fleet in harbour generally as part of its war plans. Little known fact is they actually had a plan for a massed torpedo airstrike on the high seas fleet towards the end of World War One. This is how far back this thinking had actually gone. Well, the end of World War One meant they weren't able to do it, but they had practiced the idea in principle for a very, very long time, because they knew that from their perspective, it was much better to either eliminate the enemy capital ships as soon as possible, or by attacking them in their harbour, force them to sortie into the theoretically bigger and more numerous guns of the Royal Navy. So the idea as a sort of a concept of we will attack the enemy fleet in harbour wherever they happen to be had been around for quite a while, but obviously priorities, who are they going to actually attack in this manner, meant that looking at Taranto specifically in this context came up rather late in the 1930s. Because every harbour is different, obviously, so you have to make certain adjustments.
And initially, the aircraft carrier that was initially considered was the Glorious, because Captain Lister had his very swordfish squadron capable of night attack with night attack training. But Glorious then went up north and got sunk in the Norwegian campaign. But there were more carriers coming. Yeah? Sorry?
I was saying, it just a little bit sunk, yes.
Yes.
Just a little bit sunk, yeah. By the Terrible Twins, actually.
Yeah.
So then the choice fell on the HMS Eagle, which was in the Mediterranean. And it also had a experience with the night operations. But there were some technical troubles, right?
Yeah, the Royal Navy always wanted to do this kind of attack as a multi-carrier assault. Back in the late 20s and early 1930s, you can often see photos of glorious, courageous, and occasionally furious operating together. When it came to this particular strike, they actually did want to use both the newly arrived armoured carrier and Eagle together. But as you say, Eagle suffered some problems with its fuel systems, which meant it was out of action. So all of a sudden, it was just down to the one armoured carrier that they had.
And there were additional problems on the day of the launch as well. Things like external fuel tanks falling off the Swordfish. And they didn't launch.
Can spoil the day.
They didn't launch with many aircraft in the first place. But yeah, we're probably getting ahead of ourselves.
And at the same time, the attack had to be night because the Taranto had quite strong anti-aircraft defense. And this like 100 of heavy anti-aircraft guns and balloon barrages. And I will ask Mr. Chrysanthos to drop in the second map, which will show what exactly happened and how did it happen.
Yeah, let's not forget the 163 heavy machine gun emplacements as well.
Oh, yeah.
And the searchlight batteries, which for some strange reason they didn't use.
Yeah, well, the other thing you've got to remember with attacking during the day, apart from the AA batteries, is that ships can fight during the day. So if you're attacking at night, even if those battleships decide actually the best way of countering an attack is to move out, they still can't see very far. So you and your carrier can still make your getaway fairly easily. Whereas if you launch your attack during the day, then not only if they decide to sortie can those battleships come after you, potentially spot you and potentially shoot at you, especially considering how quick the Italian battleships could go, but also the air attack by either Regia Aeronautica or Luftwaffe forces could also come straight back and hit your carrier in reprisal, whereas the night attack eliminated both of those possibilities.
Yeah, and if 80% of your crew are asleep, it takes a damn sight longer to actually get the ship warmed up. It also takes a lot longer for the crew to get to their anti-aircraft guns.
Yeah.
As the map already suggests, the attack plan itself was fairly complicated, even though only a fairly small amount of planes participated. So you had to have
24, I think.
Yeah.
At least 2 didn't make it.
Yep. So first of all, night operations still require you to see a target, so you had to have illumination. That's the yellow line, which shows where the British actually dropped the flares to illuminate the target.
The flight of Fairy Fulmars.
Then, because the ships in the harbor were anchored in different directions, you had to hit them ideally from 2 sides, so that like at least one of the squadrons gets the ideal side shot. And then you also had some diversionary attacks on the fuel tanks, which frankly probably nobody expected too much of them. But I mean, if you are dropping bombs here, dropping torpedoes there, there is a chance that at least some of the anti-aircraft crews will be looking the other way and will ignore the torpedo bombers. So even despite the small number of planes, it was quite a complex operation, and it worked.
Yeah. One of the things that you must always bear in mind, which gives you the shivers whenever you think about it, is the poor old Swordfish. They had to put in an auxiliary fuel tank so that it had enough range to do this attack and come back again. The auxiliary fuel tank was not the kind of underneath drop tank type thing that you'd usually think of. It was a vaguely cubic riveted metal thing that was stuck in the middle seat of the Swordfish, because Swordfish is a 3-seater aircraft. You have the pilot, the observer, and the rear gunner. The observer does most of the navigation. So with his seat taken up, they had to kick the rear gunner out. The observer had to now double up as the rear gunner, except that it turned out that when you stuck a riveted box full of aviation fuel in a swordfish, which in and of itself is mostly canvas and wood, which tends to flex a fair bit, you had an awful lot of leaks, which meant the poor old observer was quite often journeying on his way to somewhere that was firing lots of incendiary tracer ammunition at them, waist deep in aviation fuel. So, yeah, if he was hit...
That doesn't sound like a tempting prospect.
No, but at least he had a good idea of how much fuel they had left in the tank as it gradually dried out.
Rather him than me.
Yep.
Oh.
But out of the two waves, the torpedo hits were scored actually on 3 battleships out of the 6 present. So that's, I mean, fairly nice 50% percentage. Out of those 3, one, the Caio Duilio, was damaged lightly and was run aground, so didn't really sink. But the remaining 2 had quite some considerable damage and flooding. One of them was the old modernized Conte di Cavour. Cavour? I'm not sure how to pronounce the Italian names actually, and we are missing our Italian colleague here to slap me around the head, which was basically the captain was asking for permission to ground her, but that was delayed, so before they can run her aground, she sunk. Was subsequently raised and spent quite a long time in repairs because obviously as the old battleships she was lower priority. And then there was the modern battleship, the Littorio, and I will ask Mr. Chrysanthus for picture number 3, which suffered 3 hits, 1 aft and 2 in the front, and as you can see, she got in pretty bad shape, and she got flooded and sunk to the bottom, which obviously meant that also, apart from the water, she took on also quite a lot of sand through the holes. And obviously that then delayed the repairs and made it pretty hard to actually deal with it.
Yeah, and it actually shows as part of the problem that you have when it comes to trying to defend a ship from aerial torpedo strikes, because any torpedo defense system needs a fair bit of depth to actually work. And as the ship gets narrower towards the bow and towards the stern, you don't have that depth. So whilst the torpedo defense system amidships is usually really strong, it will narrow down until eventually it gets to a point where most of your theoretically critical systems are protected, and also there's basically no width left in the ship, so the torpedo defense system effectively stops, and then those ends are much more vulnerable to flooding. And in this case, you can see 1 hit directly on the stern, there's not really going to be much defense there. The big hole in the bow, the minimal torpedo defense there as well. The only one where there was actually any kind of significant amount of torpedo defense was underneath a turret, which you can see the 2nd hit. And the torpedo defense system failed there, albeit that it wasn't at full width. It was part way to full width. The full width was only over the machinery space on the Littorio.
Thing is, that forward torpedo hit, I mean, it looks bad. And it is bad, but the only thing that they would have had to be damaged that far forward in the ship would have been possibly a paint locker, the cable locker for the anchor cables, and all of the wires and ropes that would have been used on the forecastle. They might have had some stores, some dry stores. That would have been it. So nothing critically damaged there. But the damage to the internal bulkheads, which allowed the flooding to get to such an extent to sink the ship as it did there, that was pretty bad.
Yeah, and obviously water in places you don't want.
The wall was supposed to be on the outside.
Of the 2 ends of the ship, it's kind of, if you're going to get hit in the bow or stern, it's a devil's choice, because if you get hit in the stern, as Bismarck found out, you're very likely to lose a rudder, a propeller, or both, which can very seriously compromise your ability to maneuver, especially if you're at sea. Whereas if you get hit in the bows, obviously when you're stationary in a harbour, it doesn't make much odds one way or the other. But if you get hit in the bows, whilst there's somewhat less sensitive stuff there immediately, you also are hopefully moving forwards, which means you're going to be driving a lot of water past you at a very high speed. And high speed water in large amounts does tend to love going into holes and then breaking things inside them.
Yeah.
There's just an interesting question here from Pseudonym about this topic, like because he's wondering what's more effective for sinking a ship, focusing on the bow or the stern, or both together.
Well, ideally focusing anywhere on only one side of the ship.
Yeah, I mean, if you've only got one hit to make, and you're hoping that as a torpedo that's the thing that's going to kill the ship, I would probably go for the bow because of the aforementioned water rushing in and forcing bulkheads. If you've got multiple strikes coming in, the first area I'd go for between the two would be the stern because of that ability to potentially cripple the ship's ability to maneuver or move at all, at which point any subsequent operations are going to be much, much easier to score hits.
You have to bear in mind, though, when asking this sort of question, just hitting the thing in the first place is hard enough. You're not really going to be, I want to get it between the funnels. Yeah, that's what I'm aiming. No, you're just trying to hit the ship.
Yeah, I mean, even these stationary vessels, if we can see the map of the actual attack, you'll see that Vittorio Veneto was also under attack, and even though all of these ships were stationary, none of the torpedoes launched at Vittorio Veneto actually hit. And it was the same at Pearl Harbor. Stationary battleships, not all the torpedoes hit, because you'd think flying straight and level, stationary target, you should get all your hits, but of course the enemy has something of a vote, and when you're having to dodge around barrage balloons, fair enough, not as many as there should have been because the wind had blown a bunch of them away.
More than half of them away, yeah.
Yeah, but even when you're having to dodge that, you're having to dodge incoming anti-aircraft fire, and it's a very high-stress environment. It's still a fair bit of a... Yeah, and at night. And it's therefore a fair feat to actually hit at all. So you can see all the different indications of the drops.
There was actually a question about what were the barrage balloons used for. So they were in theory used exactly to prevent this sort of attack, because basically how that works, you have a balloon that is tethered on a long rope, you can have some more cables strung in between. So like if a plane flies into that cable, it's very bad news for the plane, because like the wings rip off and all sorts of unpleasantness happen. So the plane wouldn't go there, right?
No.
So basically, in theory, as you can see, the balloon barrages, those like white blobby lines, were strung in the way of the British aircraft. They partly flew around them, partly flew through the gaps. But they definitely made the pilots very nervous, and nervous pilots is less likely to hit accurately, even under the best of circumstances. And as an additional thing, the British managed to solve the problem of dropping the torpedoes actually in a shallow water, because generally accepted notion was that you have to drop into the water that is at least 20 plus meters deep to not have the torpedo stuck in the bottom. But the method they used, basically using a wire that pulled the torpedo's nose up.
Yeah. Because if you look, if you look at the ferry swordfish, and also the what was the American torpedo? But the TBD
Devastator at this point.
Yeah, the Devastator. When you look at when they're flying with the torpedo slung underneath, the nose of the torpedo is pointing slightly down. So the traditional drop pattern was you'd obviously be flying low and slow. You drop the torpedo, and the torpedo would drop in nose first, which meant the torpedo would go down to a depth of about 70 feet before coming up to its attack depth. So in order to prevent that from happening, as Tucky said, we came up with the idea of attaching a wire to the nose, so that not a wire strong enough to actually stop the torpedo from dropping away, but enough to keep the nose of the torpedo up, so it belly flopped into the water, and it only sank down to a depth of about 30-35 feet.
Yeah.
Which was ideal, because it was only 40 feet deep there.
But obviously the belly flop in itself meant that there was a good chance that the torpedo will be skewed more, of course, than with the regular drop. So basically, there's always like there never is a free lunch. So, but yes, so 3 Italian battleships were sunk or damaged. 1 cruiser was damaged by 2 unexploded bombs. The British seemed to also have some quality control issues there. I mean, the Japanese as well. So it was a widespread problem. But still, just 5 days later, the Italian heavy ships did sortie out of Taranto and made quite some mischief in the Mediterranean, even though like not sinking anything, but disrupting operations towards Malta.
What two of the things you've got to bear in mind is that Taranto was not kind of a one-off, like this is our big thing for that week or even that day. It was part of a much larger operation that the British were undertaking, which included raids on Italian convoys and movement of their own convoys around the Mediterranean, on the fairly reasonable theory that if you have a bunch of swordfish dropping torpedoes on the main Italian fleet, they're going to be slightly distracted and not able to respond to everything else that you're doing. And they actually did want to go back, or at least the admirals in charge wanted to go back the next night. Swordfish pilots, knowing that the Italians would know that they're coming, were somewhat less enthusiastic about this possibility. But bad weather meant that attack had to be called off. Although, interestingly enough, the Italians had pretty much the day after Taranto had already moved all the intact battleships elsewhere. So
Napoli.
Yeah, so it would have ended up, if it had happened, you would have ended up with just basically making things worse for the ships that had already been sunk or grounded, which in actual fact, probably, I mean, apart from the fact additional hits are worse, would have actually made things a lot more serious in another way, because as we saw from the Littorio and from the other ships, they were settling lower in the water, which meant that torpedo coming in, instead of hitting the torpedo defense system, would have hit above the torpedo defense system, either on the main armor belt or in unarmored areas, which are not designed to take torpedo hits, which means that the damage and the flooding would have been considerably more extensive than from the first attack that on the night that obviously historically happened.
There's an apocrypha has it that one of the pilots reacted to the news about the plans for the second raid with they only asked the light brigade to do it once. So
yes, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, some of those observers were probably still reeking of aviation fuel.
Yeah. Luckily, bad weather prevented the attack from going ahead. The second attack.
Yeah. But at the same time, it also kind of the attack on Taranto came in an important time from another perspective, because just short time afterwards, the Desert War got kind of kicked into a new phase by a British counterattack that basically chased the Italian army halfway from the front as in November to Tripoli, and got stopped only when a certain chap called Rommel and certain very for Italian standard very well equipped Italian divisions came to kind of stabilize the situation.
Was it I don't know. I never know how you pronounce its name, but the Italians named one of their Cold War tanks after them, the Centauro or Centauro division. Very good Italian armored division. Punched well above their weight.
And in connection to this, one of the aims of the raid on Taranto was also attempt to disrupt the Italian convoys to Africa, and in the end, it didn't really have that much effect on it. So the Mediterranean continued to be.
Just 5 days later, they were back at sea, causing all kinds of havoc.
But what it did mean is that the Royal Navy, which is, as I think Jingles mentioned earlier, had to stick together beforehand, they were now able to split into multiple tactical units, because with a reduced Italian capital ship threat, they didn't need quite the same preponderance of force in one space, which meant that they could fulfill multiple missions in multiple locations at once, which generally was very good. Occasionally, when Fliegerkorps 10 showed up in strength, that was not necessarily the wisest move, but overall, the tactical utility of having the half the Italian battle fleet out of commission for several months was highly useful.
It probably also allowed the Royal Navy to send out the Force H to try to chase Bismarck in 1941, because by that time the Italian Navy still didn't manage to fix the damage. So, I mean, everything, it's kind of like a butterfly effect. It's everything is connected with everything else.
Yeah, because I mean, people argue that Taranto was a failure because it was supposed to keep the Italian fleet damaged and unable to sail. And like you said, 5 days later, 3 battleships, a number of cruisers and destroyers sorted and caused all kinds of problems. But it did achieve the effect of allowing Cunningham much more tactical flexibility because, yes, the Italians still had ships. Yes, they could still put to sea, but they couldn't put to sea in force, not in huge, not in the potentially the same force that they could have put to sea with before Taranto, which meant that Cunningham had to keep all of his big guns together. Now he could spread them around. So in that respect, it definitely worked.
Yeah, and you look at if you look at the map we're looking at the moment, you notice there you've got the Battle of Cape Spartivento, which I think the Italians call something else, which occurs a couple of weeks after Taranto. Now that's historically a little bit of a draw. Everyone kind of shoots guns at each other and then wanders away because there's no decisive action. But now imagine if that battle had been fought, but the Italians had twice the number of battleships.
Yeah. It's not as clear cut as, well, the objective was to take the Italian Navy out of the war and therefore it was a failure because that didn't happen. There were beneficial knock-on side effects to the results of the raid. Wow, that was a bit of a conversation killer.
Yeah, I think we actually covered the basics, so I think we can move on to the questions we've got from the players all over the world, and mighty interesting questions they are. Even though I suspect that for some of them we've already covered parts in our initial talk, but let's go into them.
Yes, let's jump into questions. And the first question that we have is from Darth Michalek, and he's asking, was it possible for more carriers to participate in the attack? Because he's heard that HMS Eagle was supposed to take part in the operation, but earlier damage prevented it.
Yes, so we had, as we said, Eagle was supposed to be there as well, but issues with its fuel system meant that couldn't happen. The other thing is there was another carrier available in the Mediterranean, which was Ark Royal, which obviously had the most aircraft carrying capacity of any British carrier who was there. However, Ark Royal was with Force H in Gibraltar, and so coordinating 2 carriers to conduct a night strike from the same fleet is one thing. Obviously, then Eagle goes out of action, but trying to get Ark Royal to bypass Malta to the other side of the Mediterranean, join up with Illustrious, launch the attack, and then run all the way back again before someone cottons onto what's going on, far too tactically complex, and it was needed elsewhere. So it just meant that you had the one carrier.
So, and for Darth Michalek, the question was also, would the results would have been more similar to like Pearl Harbor, by keeping the majority of the ships out of the war for the next few years?
More torpedo bombers can't hurt.
Yeah, that was the intention. But when you consider that they only sent 24 aircraft in the first place, 2 of them had to turn back, one because its fuel tank fell off, and another one got lost, and then a bunch of them ran into bad weather and kind of got separated. So the attack was not flawless, but it was only 24 aircraft plus the ferry fulmars who were dropping flares. And they lost 2 aircraft with 2 men killed and 2 men taken prisoner. So 4 casualties. And look at what they achieved with that. Yes, if it had more carriers, if Eagle's fuel systems hadn't screwed up, but I believe they actually transferred the available strike aircraft from the Eagle to the Illustrious anyway.
Some of them, yeah.
Some of them, not all of them. So at most, they might have had another 6 swordfish. Another 6 torpedoes. Well, not even then. Not all of the swordfish were using torpedoes. Some of them were dropping bombs. So we didn't have an awful lot. This is kind of the history of Britain in war. We tend to not have much of a pot to piss in or a window to throw it out of. We just make do the best we can with what we have.
Given the listing of the weapons you just put, there is a question from Arnold van Cleef on On the YouTube, did the swordfish planes use machine guns during the raid?
I suspect the
They had
observers
machine
probably.
guns.
Yeah, I suspect the observers probably would have taken pot shots at whatever they could with their machine guns, mostly for lack of anything better to do. But to be perfectly honest, if you're attacking hardened shore targets and battleships, the pilots can be focusing on flying the plane and dropping the torpedo. So he's not, although the swordfish did have a forward-facing machine gun, he's not going to really be using it. And the rear-facing machine gun would have been more of a, and take that as well.
Yeah, I mean, because
Yep.
by the time they get to Taranto, the observer's job is done. You know, if you make it there, he's done his job well, and he's got nothing better to do other than hold on
well,
for dear life. And since
I
they
mean,
weren't being
under
attacked by
ideal
aircraft, if
circumstances,
the machine gun's there, I dare say they probably popped off a few rounds, but to no great effect.
I mean, under ideal circumstances, he then should be able to get the plane from Taranto back to the carrier, right?
Yes, but
That's the theory.
this is actually one of the other things that often goes underappreciated about British carrier operations at the time is they had a very clever but also remarkably simple way of getting aircraft back to the carrier at night. Well, actually, in all weathers, which when you look at the mast, you'll sometimes see what looks like a gigantic dustbin high up on the mast.
Yeah.
This was a radio homing system, and it worked by having a beacon that projected a very thin radio beam that just went round and round once every minute, exactly. And it started facing north, whatever bearing the ship was on, didn't matter. It would face north at the minute and would go round. So it meant that if you were on your swordfish, when you hear the blip on the right frequency, you look at your watch and you hear that blip, that tells you what bearing you are to the carrier. So if you're directly north of it, you'll hear the blip at exactly the minute, assuming you've synchronized your watch. If you're west of the carrier, you'll hear the blip at 45 seconds. And so you can just go, oh, okay, it's if they're coming back from Taranto, let's say it's 55 seconds. Okay, so I know I am northwest of the carrier, so I need to steer southeast, and I'll land up somewhere in the right area.
That I did not know.
Wow. Yes, neither did I. Like, I knew that there was a radio homing system, but I didn't know how it exactly worked. So, thank you.
Yes, and just to finish up the question here from Mr. Bechalek, he has a controversial third part of the question. So, if Operation Judgment wouldn't have taken place, would the Italian fleet have performed more aggressively in the war? And would Japan have attempted attack on Pearl Harbor?
The Japanese were planning the attack on Pearl Harbor. They were certainly wargaming it before Taranto took place. So I think Pearl Harbor was going to go ahead regardless of what happened with the Fleet Air Arm in the Mediterranean in 1940.
The preparation started in, I think, mid-1940 already for the raid. So
yes. But it wasn't that the Italian... it wasn't that the Italian Navy didn't want to fight. I don't know. The Italian Navy's leadership was questionable in places as well. But it was that if the raid hadn't happened, I don't think it would have made that much difference, because the major limiting factor for the Italians was a lack of fuel. They had the ships, they had the crews, they had the best will in the world. But if you don't have the fuel, you can't go to sea, you can't train, and you can't turn those crews into effective warfighting crews. Taranto, they bombed some fuel tanks, which certainly didn't help the Italians, but they had so little fuel in the first place. That was the major limiting factor. So I don't think in that respect, it made any difference to any aggressive tendencies on behalf of the Italian Navy.
The one thing when you look at how the Italians are performing in the Mediterranean is that it's almost at two separate tiers. You've got the highest level admirals at that point, to be perfectly honest, although they are okay at their jobs, they are very much political appointees. They're not the kind of come up by merit the way that Admiral Cunningham had. Weirdly enough, some of their lower level admirals, like Admiral Bergamini, I think, I'm sorry if any Italians listening, who eventually ended up in charge of the Italian fleet, he was actually very good. He was a legitimately good admiral, but the admiral in charge at this point, which was Admiral, I've been informed, is Iachino, even though he has a CH in his name, he tended to have very big ideas about what he should or could do with his fleet. But the minute something went wrong, he almost immediately switched to almost the other end of paranoia of thinking that was now going to happen every single time. Because remember, earlier in 1940, you'd had the Battle of Cape Matapan. Up until that point, he was perfectly happy to lead his forces out on multi-day missions against the Royal Navy. After the Battle of Cape Matapan, he saw HMS Warspite hiding behind every cloud and shadow at night, and so basically was completely paranoid about taking the Italian fleet anywhere that there might be a British ship after nightfall. And similarly with Taranto, these individual attacks or individual British victories do seem to have then made him progressively more and more scared to take significant Italian forces into direct conflict with British forces.
Yeah.
And that just went on throughout the war. But the individual Italian crews and captains were actually pretty good at their jobs.
And especially the light forces had quite a lot of very, very crazy attempts. I mean, there was even an attempt at a direct attack on Malta harbor with torpedo boats and demolition units, which did not work out. But like, it took really guts to do that, because
and the successful miniature submarine attack on Alexandria.
Yeah.
Yes. Sinking 2 British battleships. That was kind of a nice payback for the Taranto.
Yeah, and it's similar thing after Cape Matapan. Italian motor torpedo boats managed to sink the heavy cruiser HMS York in Suda Bay off of Crete. Effectively, if you want to look at it as a rule of thumb for Italian naval effectiveness in the Mediterranean in World War II, the further away the unit in question is from being directed by a central command, the more successful they are.
Then, yeah, I guess we can move to another question. And since number 2 was already covered before, we can skip to number 3.
Yes, so that Kyle dude from NA is asking, why did the Royal Navy not just simply park a couple of battleships a bunch of miles away and open fire on the Italians? Why not combine the naval firepower with the aviation?
I think the Italians would have objected.
Yes. Those battleships have to get away again. And it's not dark forever in the Mediterranean, even in November. They would have been within striking range of land-based air power. It would have just been way too risky. There was no way Cunningham was ever going to risk his battleships like that, or even his cruisers for that matter. So, yeah, very simple answer to that question. Way too dangerous. The risks outweigh the benefits.
Yeah, with the closer you get to an enemy coastline, the more and more short-range units come into play. So you've got the aircraft, as we mentioned, but you've also got the Italian motor torpedo boats, which are very good at their job. I think they're called MAS boats, MAS.
Yes.
Obviously short range, but if you're right off their coast, that doesn't matter. You've also got...
If you're close enough to shoot at them, you're within range of the motor torpedo boats.
And you've also got various small coastal submarines, which are obviously also bad news. And the other key thing is not just the number of aircraft, but the weapons loads that they can carry. Because if you're operating off of, say, Crete, or even further Cyprus, you either need a very large aircraft, like, say, an S-79, carrying a torpedo, or you need to carry a light bomb load to have the range to get there. So even if they manage to score a hit, and obviously flying in with a big tri-motor is a lot easier a target, or if you hit with, say, a 500-pound bomb, most large ships can resist that kind of attack. Whereas if you're up close, you can have smaller, lighter weight aircraft carrying torpedoes, which are going to be much more maneuverable, have a much better, easier time of attacking. And also those bombers and dive bombers are going to be carrying the big, heavy bombs that they can't carry to the other end of the Mediterranean. So, yeah, you might have on a modernized Queen Elizabeth, you might have 5 or 6 inches of cumulative deck armor, and if someone drops a 500-pound bomb on you, it's annoying, but you're probably going to live. If someone shows up with a 2,200-pound armor-piercing bomb, that's an entirely different story.
Yes, and given the pretty copious amounts of Italian medium bombers, one of them was bound to make some hit eventually. Even though level bombing was not really all working as well as everyone expected before the war, still it adds up, and ultimately there would be a lucky bomb or torpedo hit, and So number 4 from Gneisenau. Hello, Gneisenau 13, one of our colleagues from NA. So I'll just quickly take it. Given the proximity of the Italian mainland to the battle, why was the Italian Air Force and the Marina Regia naval air assets not put into action against the Royal Navy Task Force?
Because
Night.
it happened at night. The Royal Navy was the only navy in the world at the time that was capable of conducting night operations. That was capable of conducting night aviation operations. There were plenty of navies in the world. Well, not plenty, but there were certainly a few navies in the world that were entirely capable of conducting night operations. But we were the only navy in the world at the time who was capable of launching, fighting, and recovering aircraft at night. And they wouldn't have been able to find them. They didn't have radar, and they didn't like fighting at night. That was why we did it at night, because we could, and we were basically immune to counterattack.
And in a very strange way, you can actually thank the Germans for that, because after the complete and utter debacle that was the night action at Jutland, practically every single Royal Navy officer from lieutenant grade upwards had it drummed into them for the next 2 decades. We will learn how to fight at night properly. And a lot of the people who were senior commanders, from captains all the way through admirals in World War II, had been junior officers in World War One, so they'd had the entire of the interwar period being told, no, we will learn how to fight tonight because we do not want that opportunity to slip through our fingers again. Which meant the Royal Navy went from kind of, yeah, we don't actually do the whole night fighting, to this is our speciality now.
Pretty much.
Yep. So what's next?
So the next question we have is that there are a lot of memes and jokes around Italy's lack of industry in World War II. So it surprised him to hear that the Italians have a shipbuilding industry capable of battleship construction. Why was Italy's shipbuilding industry so strong compared to other industrial activities like aviation and tank production? A question here from the really good man from the NA server.
Yeah, so I take this question, so I'll start, and you guys feel free to jump in. But I think the main issue here is the engines. And the ship engines are, I would say, relatively simpler to make than tank or plane engines, because you have a lot of room to play with. So like, you can make a big powerful engine and you can fit it in a ship, you can build a ship around it, and voila. While with the aviation and tank production, you are always restricted by what engines you have, and Italian engine industry was kind of pushed between the wars in trying to build record-breaking engines for record-breaking planes, because that made Il Duce look nice on the world stage, like the fastest plane in the world, Italian and stuff like that. But that kind of did lead, with the limited capacity, to kind of neglecting the development of the ordinary daily use engines that survive more than few hours at full power and stuff like that. And that's a problem already, because you have to build your planes around the engine. You just cannot make a overweight plane, because then it doesn't take off, doesn't maneuver. So especially for fighters, the Italian fighters suffered a lot. For the bombers, it was a bit better off, because you can always slap a third engine, and Italians had a very nice medium bombers with the triple engine design, which was kind of anachronic at the time, but still, again, it's better to have a good bomber with 3 engines than a bad one with 2. And it also influenced tanks, because if you look, for example, at the British or American tank production, a lot of tank engines were rejects from the aircraft production. So if you have the capacity where even if the engine doesn't work for planes, you can still slap it in a tank and have a decent tank engine, go for it. But Italy didn't have this overhang of the engine production, and again, they were limited by that. And again, with the tank, it's the same as with the plane. You cannot really build a too heavy tank so that the engine doesn't move it. So that's why the shipbuilding was in let's say, better shape than the aviation and tank production. And obviously, if you have a good ship engine, you can then slap all the modern guns on the ship, because the Italian, especially the Italian modern battleships, modern cruisers, had some very decent main guns and anti-aircraft guns. So I
Yeah.
think that's
Plus,
the
you
main.
also have to look at the geographical location of Italy. It's surrounded by the sea on 3 of its 4 sides. Traditionally, they had a strong shipbuilding industry, so it shouldn't really be surprising that they could churn out warships. Although it's building a tramp steamer is a damn sight different to building a warship. Obviously, there's making a 14, 15, 16-inch gun barrel isn't just as simple as you might think it is. Drakenfell himself has done many videos on this subject, but they had the basic infrastructure in place that a lot of other countries wouldn't have, purely because of their maritime tradition. So it's probably not too surprising that they were capable of fielding a decent navy.
Yeah, and the other thing is, I don't know so much about the ground forces, but I certainly know with the air forces, the Italians kind of had a little bit of a problem in that they modernized just too early. You look at the pace of technological change that was occurring in the 1930s, the Italians actually had a fairly modern air force in 1937 and 1938. If they'd gone to war then, it would have been fantastic. They would have been ahead of everyone else. The only problem was by 1939, 1940, the next generation had arrived and they were a bit stuck. When it comes to shipbuilding, as Jingle said, they have this maritime tradition. They actually have a fairly strong tradition, also very innovative shipbuilding in the century or so running up to World War II. If you look at the era of the ironclads, they have a lot of very innovative technologies, like they have the Italia class, which is an attempt at a late ironclad - early pre-dreadnought that goes full-on Admiral Fisher style. Speed is armor. We don't have armor, but we have very big guns. And of course, it was Cuniberti who first officially forwarded the idea of an all-big gun battleship. So, and even when you look at the dreadnoughts that the Italians built for World War I, and present Taranto in their modernized forms, they are actually fairly advanced for their day. If you look at almost everybody else's ships at the time that those Italian ships are being laid down, everyone else is using twin turrets. The Italians have solved how to make triple turrets, and they have a sort of I wouldn't hesitate to call it a cultural propensity, but they certainly have a naval propensity of going very fast at the expense of some other things like armor, which to a certain extent actually served them relatively well, because it meant that the Andrea Doria, Giulio Cesare, Conte di Cavour, and Caio Duilio, when they were fully modernized, they could actually modernize them up to with modern machinery to keep a speed that was fairly useful for their operations. Whereas ships that had been designed somewhat slower and with somewhat heavier armor, like say the R class, were never going to get up to frontline battle status just because of that speed that wasn't really going to be improved all that much.
Perfect, thank you. Moving on to the next question from Silo. And he's wondering about how well could you actually reasonably expect to defend a harbor like Taranto with static defenses against air attack in the early 1940s? Was it just a case of the bomber always gets through, or were there lessons to be learned from the Taranto attack that could mitigate or prevent such a disaster? In particular, he's wondering whether the US and other naval powers, or powers in general, actually learned from Taranto when it came to defense against such attacks, and did they apply these lessons in a timely manner?
The thing is, the war showed that basically the bomber generally always gets through unless you have really very unbalanced air defense situations, like the torpedo attacks against Japanese at Midway. You always have a few of the bombers that get through and that drop ordnance and that have chance to score damage. Again, the Japanese attacks against the Yorktown at Midway, where basically both attacks were utterly massacred, but still they managed to cripple the carrier. So the best lesson that should have been learned from Taranto, I think, is scouting. That basically you have to discover the potential incoming attack far enough so that you can do something about it. Because, I mean, if you discover it at the time, you can at least go on full alert, close the watertight compartments, do such stuff. If you discover it soon enough, you can even sortie and basically make yourself harder to hit and harder to find, which also wasn't a trivial matter. And Yeah, the secondary lesson probably would be that barrage balloons are a useful thing if they don't get blown away, and torpedo nets are a useful
Yeah.
thing as well.
Yes, if the torpedo nets actually have full coverage and actually reach down to the bottom of the harbour, and if 60 barrage balloons blow away 3 days before you replace them. And if you have searchlight batteries covering the harbour, turn them on. Little
Mhm.
things like
Yep.
that generally improve your odds against an air attack.
Yeah, it's a bit of a catch-22 with a harbour, really, because if you have a harbour that's very shallow and very built up, it's very easy to defend, but it's also almost impossible to see an attack coming from long range or engage an attack that's coming in from long range. And a shallow harbour means you can only support certain kinds of shipping. A deeper, wider, more open harbour means you can see a target coming, you can support a much bigger fleet in it, but it also means it's much more open to attack on all sides. If there was any one big takeaway lesson from Taranto, I would say it's probably that radar really had become absolutely key. Because
I was just going to say, or you could do what we did and invent radar.
yes, because the Italians' awareness of their raid on Taranto was, what's all the pretty lights in the sky? Why is everything exploding? Somebody shoot at those people. Whereas if you've got radar, you can see them coming, and even if it's nighttime and you can't scramble fighters to intercept, you can at least get everybody to their stations, have the searchlights going, have the AA guns firing, and be ready for what's coming.
Well, as we saw just 1 year after that, having radar and actually spotting the enemy doesn't help if someone doesn't pick up the phone, right?
Well, yeah, there are these minor things like talking to each other that does help.
Yeah, you have to trust your technology. I mean, that wasn't just Pearl Harbor. Look at Guadalcanal. Yes, sorry,
Yeah.
Total mind block there. Had the radar, didn't trust it.
Yep.
Yeah, and that also answers actually a question from Yamato 8125 from the EU server, who was asking if there were more heavy AA operational to protect the pod, would that cause less damage to the Italian fleet and made the Swordfish easy targets?
Well, it wouldn't really make the Swordfishes easy targets, and frankly, given the failure to actually open fire before the pretty lights started to show up, it wouldn't probably influence the first wave that much. But yeah, I think we've already covered that.
Yeah,
But,
I mean,
obviously, more AA helps.
Yeah, and to be honest, the Swordfish lives in this charmed little world where it's actually so hopelessly obsolete that a lot of heavy AA shells just go straight through its canvas structure. So actually, heavy AA is probably the least useful of the AA that you want. You probably want more medium
machine
and
guns.
light. Yeah, because you
40
can throw enough rounds into the air and eventually you'll hit something important like engine or the pilot, because that's pretty much the only way you bring a Swordfish down unless you erode it out of the sky.
Speaking actually of the light A, the Italians had some quite decent 20mm guns, right?
Yeah, they had a whole range of interesting AA guns. It's one of these weird things where, again, if you try and look at it of a top trumps kind of capability of it, so many rounds per minute, such elevation, such tracking, etc. Italian AA was pretty strong on paper. I mean, you just look at the number of 90mm guns that are on the side of a Littorio class, but that has to be paired with decent tracking technology, which they had it during the day, but not so much at night. But as Jingles said earlier, and as I think we've collectively pointed out quite often in various other Armchair Admirals, the crew are key. If you don't train your crew, it doesn't matter how good your technology is, doesn't matter how good your weapons are, you're still not going to hit anything.
Yeah.
Yep. Moving on to the next question from Drialga. It says, hello, Crusaders, Tucky, Draconifel, and the almighty Overlord Jingles. Why was the HMS Illustrious armed with the outdated ferry Swordfish torpedo bombers instead of more recent aircraft like the Bristol Beauforts or the Bristol Beaufighters, especially considering that this battle was before the Swordfish became famous for crippling the beast made of steel that was the Bismarck in Operation Rheinübung?
Someone listens to Sabaton, I see.
We didn't have anything better, unfortunately. The string bag was. I mean, we were attempting to design a replacement for the Swordfish before World War II broke out, I think, but everything that we came up with just was a bit crap.
Yeah.
And so the Swordfish soldiered on.
And both the planes mentioned here were also twin engines, so they probably wouldn't fit in the elevators, especially not without folding wings and stuff.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, an adapted bow fighter probably could have fitted, but that was a point I wanted to actually pick up. The first twin-engined landing on a carrier didn't come until right towards the end of the war with a Mosquito.
I'm sorry, I have to just
Emergency.
Oh,
that's right. Yes, as I say, the first twin-engine aircraft landing was a Mosquito towards the end of the war. So at this point in the war, despite the theoretical technical capability to do so, no one had actually proven that you could land a heavy twin-engined aircraft on a carrier at this point. And as Jingles was pointing out, the replacement for the Swordfish was supposed to be the Albacore, and the less said about the Albacore, the better.
Yes.
They took everything that was the Swordfish and made it worse. To be fair, the other problem the Fleet Air Arm had was that in 1939 they had a whole load of wonderful designs lined up. They just got control of the Fleet Air Arm back off the Royal Air Force. They had all these wonderful aircraft designs lined up, ready to completely modernize the aircraft they had on the carriers. And then World War II broke out, which meant, one, a lot of design projects were scrapped because you just needed to churn out what you already had. Two, the Luftwaffe did a very nice job of blowing up a bunch of Fleet Air Arm stores depots, which had a lot of spare parts and spare engines and such for what they already had, which depleted the numbers of aircraft through maintenance attrition. And three, because of the Battle of Britain, demand for engines, demand for factory space, demand for design bureaus to upgrade existing aircraft was all being funneled towards the RAF. One of the great what-ifs of World War II is the fact that in 1939, little known fact, the Fleet Air Arm actually had a drawing board design for a Spitfire, but a Spitfire like you've never seen it before, because the Spitfire, when it was converted to the Seafire, it was a good aircraft, thoroughly unsuited for carrier operations. This version actually looked a bit like the hybrid child of a Spitfire and an F4U Corsair. Completely different wing layout, specifically designed wide, strong undercarriage for carrier operations. Theoretically, could have been in production in early 1940, would have been world-beating as a carrier-based fighter, except one, it used a Spitfire airframe, and two, it used a Merlin engine, and the RAF just went, no, those belong to us.
Yeah.
And that was that. By the time
taking our hands from our kit.
Yeah, and by the time the pressure was off of mainland Britain's air defences, at that point you're midway through a war, so it's much easier to just go, you know what, we're going to take a Spitfire and we're going to stick an arrestor hook on it, and when they break, we're going to chuck it over the side and bring out a new one.
I believe we kind of covered the questions from the Really Good Man and Yogi Khan as well, because they were basically focused on the same thing. Even though the Yogi Khan also mentions that Swordfish had an accidental advantage in the hunt for the Bismarck and Taranto raid, but yeah, it wasn't really planned that way.
No, it was more through luck than judgment.
I mean, you don't design your planes like relying on the enemy shells passing through.
No.
The cruise would object.
Yes.
Yeah, so we'll move on to the next question from Grumman F4F from the NA7. He's asking, did the Naval Command plan on just the one raid, and was there any thought to conduct a follow-up if the damage done was not as high as it was hoped?
Well, we pretty much covered this one earlier. There was supposed to be a second attack wave to follow up on the success of the initial attack, at which point one of the pilots in the Illustrious's ready room said, bloody hell, they only made the Light Brigade go once. But bad weather called it off. And yes, it might have kept some of those battleships out of the war for longer than they did anyway, but they probably would not have gotten away with only having 2 aircraft shot down if they'd gone a second time.
And as for subsequent plans for another attack later on. I'm not really sure. Basically, for actions like this, you usually have like one shot at it, because after that the enemy builds up his defenses and fixes the issues. At least you think that he will, because you would. So it was like it was like one-off, and trying to do it again, let's say a year later, when the Italian Navy again became a major nuisance, wouldn't necessarily work that well.
Yeah, the Italians massively beefed up the defences of Taranto in the aftermath. Fair enough, it took them a few months, but yeah, coming back 3 to 6 months later, it would have been in a completely different story.
Talking about
they wouldn't have
completely
fallen for
different
that one
story.
twice.
Just have to read out a comment here from Tasapi 1977, who says he just found out that Jingles was on one of his ships, the HMS Brazen. He was on her
Yes.
from 84 to 87 as the ASWD. Small word, by the way, that makes Jingles
Wow.
a sprock.
That's right. That's right. I was on the Brazen was my first ship. First Gulf War, 1992. I think I left the ship in 92. So, yep, that was my first ship. So, definitely, if you were on there in the 80s, I am a sprog compared to you.
Broke.
You could be
What
my
does it
sea
even
daddy.
mean?
You should clip that and definitely play that several times.
You know, a sea daddy is a thing, by the way. It probably doesn't mean what you think it means. But generally speaking, when somebody joins when a sprog, somebody fresh out of training joins a ship, they're assigned to a mess deck, and if the leading hand of that mess deck is any good, he'll pick one of the senior able ratings to be his sea daddy, to make sure that he knows where he's supposed to be, just basically so that he's got somebody to ask questions of whenever he's lost and he doesn't know where he's supposed to be, and so on and so on. So that is an actual thing. It's not what most of you dirty-minded buggers probably thought it meant.
Today
Well,
I
it's
actually
learned
something
what a
good.
sea daddy is.
I,
Yes.
I mean, everyone knows the Winston Churchill's quip about the glorious
Yeah,
traditions, right?
yeah. It's nothing but rum, sodomy, and the lash.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so moving on to the next question from JK Hunter, who's asking, were there any attempts by the Royal Navy to mimic or copy the efforts of the Lichemi Flotilla MAS with regards to attacking ships while at anchor?
Well, yes. Learn from the best, right?
Yes, the Italian torpedo boats were very successful. The Royal Navy had its own equivalent, which were the MTBs, the motor torpedo boats. However, part of the reason, not all of it, because obviously the Italian motor torpedo boat crews were very good at their jobs, but part of the reason the Italian torpedo boats had such success was there were an awful lot of Royal Navy ships, so they had a fair number of targets to pick from.
Yeah. The target-rich environment is always good.
Yeah, the Italian Navy had a gradually decreasing number of ships, and they were generally locked up, especially after Taranto, in very, very well defended anchorages, which made it much harder to get at. The Kriegsmarine was pretty much in the same situation, so most of the British motor torpedo boat and accompanying motor gunboat battles tended to be having vicious point-blank fights with German E-boats, or S-boats, if you want to be more technically accurate, in the English Channel.
But I will quickly jump here, because the question is specifically asking about the 10th flotilla of the MAS, which was a cover name for the Frogmen, for the
Yes.
for the Mayale attacks. And for those who don't know, Mayale was basically a
That's how you
manned
pronounce it.
torpedo. The name literally translated meant pig, right? Because it handled like a pig in the water. And basically, you have a torpedo with a detachable warhead and two guys who are crazy enough to get on it and usually lucky enough to survive, even though not necessarily escape.
The British version was called Chariot and was directly inspired by that. Those operations. They went on to have some fairly decent success, mostly against the Japanese. but the British would also develop the concept into the X-craft, little midget submarines with 2-ton explosive payloads, which went around setting charges under the ships that rather resented it, like Tirpitz.
Tirpitz.
Yeah, and I believe Takao at the, by the end of the war. But yeah, basically the X-craft and the chariots were definitely based on the Italian Maiale and their success, which was crowned by sinking of the Queen Elizabeth and Valiant in the Alexandria harbor. It's kind of funny that one of the guys who sunk the Valiant, Durant Luigi della Pen, then after Italy switched sides, joined the Italian units on Allied side and basically kept on doing the same thing. Among others, he participated in sinking the block ships in La Spezia harbor, so that the Germans couldn't use them to block the harbor.
If you're good at your job.
Yeah, and to top it off, he got actually medal, Italian military medal, both for this action and for sinking the Valiant. And the former commander of HMS Valiant, who interviewed him just before the charges exploded, insisted on giving him the award himself, because he was at the time a British naval attaché in Italy. So kind of like, well, fair game. I mean, it was just a ship. Nobody was killed in the attack, actually. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, this kind of bears out the point I made earlier, because these guys operating on these small underwater attack craft are about as far away as is possible to be from the Italian Admiralty, and therefore actually able to use their own initiative and brains, and turned out to actually be very good, very professional officers and men who knew what they were doing.
Indeed. So moving on to the next question from Rasmus at 2716, and we already answered part of his question about why there weren't any good replacements for the Swordfish torpedo bombers. But the second part of his question is, why didn't the Italians build any aircraft carriers?
I think the map of the Mediterranean will help.
Yeah. Tucky, you've gone silent, or maybe it's just me. I can't hear anything you're saying.
Oh, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, there it is.
Yeah, okay. I asked Mr. Chrysanthos for the map of the Mediterranean area, because it will help in the first map. Yes. This will help in answering this, I guess.
What do they need aircraft carriers for? Look at that.
Yes. Basically, you have aircrafts in Libya, from Tripoli to Benghazi to Tobruk. You have
aircraft in Sardinia.
Yes, you have Sardinia, so you are basically covering the gate from the western third of the Mediterranean. You have airfields on Dodecanese Islands, so you are kind of covering the gate from the eastern third of the Mediterranean. And you have Sicily right in the middle.
And you're not doing this alone, because the Luftwaffe have a few things to say about it. So you've got air bases in Crete, you've got air bases all around the southern coast. Well, not so much the southern coast of France, but certainly within range. You can cover Gibraltar. You've got air bases in North Africa. Why do you need aircraft carriers? And also, it's not just as simple as building aircraft carriers. Even if you could, you have to know how to operate them. And operating aircraft carriers effectively is not something that you can just pick up. It takes years. Even navies that were operating aircraft carriers tended, with the notable exception of the Japanese, tended to operate them fairly badly the first time they used them in action, until they spent months or years perfecting the technique. It's not something that you can just pick up and do. It requires training, exercising, and at the end of the day, look at the map. What does Italy need with aircraft carriers when it's got airfields that can cover the entire Mediterranean?
Yeah,
and you've also got to bear... So I was going to say, you've also got to bear in mind, the Italian Navy in most of the interwar period was built up with the specific intention of fighting the French Navy. They weren't thinking that much about going east. It was mostly that little section of the Western Mediterranean for which land-based air cover was more than adequate. It was only really when they had to reach out past Crete and towards Crete and Cyprus that they began to realize, well, actually, unless the Germans obviously ended up conquering Greece and giving them more air support from there, that there is a gap there. So they do try to build a couple of carriers, Aquila and Spaviero, I think. That's what they're called, I think. My Italian pronunciation is not great. But these were...
Yeah.
Sorry? Yeah, these were...
Sorry, you first.
Sorry. I was going to say, these were conversions of other ships. They weren't purpose-built carriers, and they didn't quite get them completed in time before the end of the war. There was some talk at one point about turning Impero, the fourth Littorio, into a carrier as well, but considering the ship never actually got to a completed state, we'll never really know what they would have eventually sprung for on that.
Yeah. And I think even this was more of a all the best navies have them, so we have to have them too, on behalf of Mussolini, rather than the Italian Admiralty actually wanting them. I mean, I'm sure, if we're going to give them some carriers, they would have been entirely happy, but the air cover that they enjoyed just because of their position in the Mediterranean was, on paper at least, certainly more than adequate.
If only the Air Force talked with the Navy.
And we actually have Dr. Alexander Clark in chat on YouTube. So welcome. If you missed him, he was actually part of our last episode. And he's saying it's the classic. They were building based on the mid-1940s war, so war came too early again. They wanted the aircraft carriers to provide organic task force air defense.
Literally everyone was planning for war in the early 1940s. The Germans thought it was going to be 1944. The British thought it was going to be 1942. The Japanese were kind of, whenever our oil reserves start to get threatened too much by US embargoes, that everyone was projecting a war some point in the early to mid 1940s. And so when war came in 1939 for most theaters of World War II, and obviously 1941 for the Americans and the Japanese, a lot of programs were caught on the hop. There was a lot of aircraft, a lot of ships designed and building that either completed late or didn't complete at all because of the war interfering, and therefore everyone going to war with 2/3 of the fleet they thought they were going to get.
At least it forced the Royal Navy to actually come up with a very good ground-controlled interception for their fighters around Norway, because they actually entered the war with the fighters that were slower than the bombers they were supposed to catch. So, you have to really plot the intercept because you have only one shot at it.
Yeah, well, the Rock is a hilarious case of there's nothing particularly wrong with the turret in and of itself. There's nothing particularly wrong with the airframe for its time period in and of itself. But put the two together and a little bit of the wrong tech tree advancement there.
Yep. Yeah, Juno191 is commenting on YouTube. Where have we seen this before? Where two branches didn't get along? Japan, I'm looking at you.
Yeah, although at least in the Italian and Royal Navy cases, they weren't actively trying to assassinate each other. It does help.
It definitely.
Nobody can prove a thing. Cunningham's the only one who knows where the bodies are buried.
Yeah, we have an interesting question here also from Clyde182, who's asking, how is it that the US Navy had over a full year to review the successful raid by the Royal Navy, Pearl Harbor just barely 10 feet deeper than Taranto, and yet the Americans paid no attention to or give credence to its success? Why was this? Japan certainly did that. So how did the US Navy not learn better lessons from this?
I don't know, because the Japanese certainly paid attention. They had people
they
inspecting the harbour at Taranto within a week of the attack.
Yeah, sorry.
No, I mean, as we said, they'd been planning the specific Pearl Harbor attack for months prior to Taranto, and a general, obviously, attack against America for years prior. And so when the news of Taranto broke out, they were extremely keen to go and see exactly what happened.
How did they do
people
that?
There.
Yeah, there were basically three things that really meant that the Americans didn't take away as much as they probably should have from Taranto. One of which was there was an American officer who saw the whole thing unfold, wrote a very detailed report back to the US Admiralty at home and said, this is probably something we should pay attention to, given how many carriers that the Japanese have, and the fact that the British have just proved that a shallow harbour isn't actually all that much of a stop to torpedoing things. And it, to a certain extent, not quite, but almost entirely, predicted exactly what the Japanese could do to the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, and his report was binned. So yeah, well done there, whichever pen pusher did that, because they just didn't believe him. Another aspect of it was that, to a certain degree, they didn't believe the Japanese could physically reach Pearl Harbor because of the operational range of the carriers and their escorts. And they were technically correct in that they couldn't, but the Japanese actually, for all that's commonly said about them, they actually had a fairly surprisingly sophisticated refueling system, which is how they actually kept their carriers and their escorts fueled enough to get to Pearl Harbor. Now, fair enough, it was right at the end of their logistical train, but they could do it, which the Americans didn't realize. And the other thing, which has been covered to a fairly extensive degree in the 2 videos that I've done with Justin on the Zero fighter, there was a certain element of they're Japanese, they're not European, American, they cannot possibly be as advanced as us, they cannot be possibly as tactically aware as us, they must be inferior. Therefore, if the Royal Navy did this, the Japanese can't possibly do this because they are strange yellow men across the Pacific. And I'm not exaggerating, that was the attitude of a lot of US Navy officers. So combine those 3 things, and they don't pay anywhere near as much attention as they should have done. And obviously, they pay for it.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We also have a question here about the technology sharing between allies from Dad the Bad. He says it's his understanding that the Italian Navy lacked radar. In light of the success of Britain and the USA sharing their radar technology, why do you think that Germany did not share their radar technology with Italy? And also, if they had shared it, what impact would it have made on the Italian Navy operations?
Because Hitler didn't trust the Italians. He constantly viewed Mussolini as nothing more than just an annoyance to him. He was constantly getting frustrated that he kept having to prop up the Italian Navy and army with German units that he was trying to get ready to invade Russia. He just you have to remember, Hitler's ideology was based on the supremacy of the German master race. I mean, Italians, that was the attitude. Happy to have them as allies as long as he didn't have to, pay too much of a price for it. And he started to get increasingly annoyed with Mussolini. The more Mussolini started making demands of him. So the last thing that he was probably going to want to do was to hand over some, proprietary technology.
Yeah, and radar is a very cutting-edge technology at this point. The ability to produce radar sets is somewhat limited. Obviously, they do make a lot of them, but there's always more demand for radar for most of the war than there are sets available. So the Germans aren't going to be going, yes, well, we'll divert half a dozen of our ship surface search or air search radar sets over to the Italian fleet for their use, because the Kriegsmarine is going, no, we rather want those for our own ships. The Italians had their own radar program, which they would eventually start back up again, which I think it was called GUFO, the radar itself. But I say start back up again because they'd gotten so far with it and then gone, I don't really think this is much of a thing that's going to be the next generation. So they'd stopped developing it. Obviously, when you had things like Cape Matapan, they had a lot of Italian admirals sitting there going, maybe we shouldn't have done that. But by that point, it does take a little bit of a while to, one, actually restart the program, get something that works, and then get it into production. And given that World War II, even though it's a very long war as wars go, it still is only 4 or 5 years in terms of the development of a next generation operational system like a radar, especially given the Italians were actually only involved in the war for 3 or 4 years. it doesn't really give you a lot of time.
And even if you do get radar on board the ships, you need the fuel to put those ships to sea to make the radar effective.
Yes, and also you need to have the good enough industrial base to actually produce the radars, because I mean, the Allies generally could have the luxury of basically improving the radar systems every year, and that goes for air defense, for navy, even for airplanes. But generally, especially Italy and Japan couldn't really keep up with the innovation so fast, and couldn't, even if they reached the solution, they couldn't produce enough sets for the ships and for air defense and for whoever else needs radar. So that's also another thing. Like,
Well,
if you
and-
have a powerful industrial base, you can afford to innovate faster.
Yeah, and you, again, it's because it's a new developing technology. There are certain technological breakthroughs like the cavity magnetron, which allows for microwave radars, which if one side has it, the other side has to invent it themselves, and they're not going to know that the other side has it. So that's going to be a delay. And with that kind of, the other thing is with a progression of radar, it's not just we have radar, because the easiest and earliest radars that everyone puts out are air search radars. That doesn't help you for the surface, but it'll show you that an aircraft's coming from further away, but that's it. The next easiest is surface search, and then only then, once both of those are working, then you can start thinking about surface fire control radar to actually help you shoot at night.
Actually, I would
Because
argue that
because in
maybe
the
even
battle-
based on the German experience, the easiest surface use radar is rangefinder, which was the German Z-Act, right? It was a very, very good range-finding radar, but it sucked at everything else.
And don't forget the Battle of Cape Matapan, which was basically won not just because the Royal Navy trained in night fighting, but because we were able to locate the Italian fleet with radar. We only had surface search radar. We didn't have fire control radar. The fleet crept up to the Italians until they got to a range of around about 2 kilometers. Then they turned the searchlights on and got the first set of shots off, and that was pretty much all it wrote. So, there's more than one kind of radar, and at various different stages of the war, certainly at this stage, it would have been just ridiculous for the Italians to have been able to develop their own that early on. And backing up what Tucky said about Italian industrial infrastructure, yes, they had an impressive navy. Their ships were good. Their older ships had been modernized, but it had taken them 35 years to build that up. At this stage in World War II, they were kind of like in the same situation as Japan. Anything that they lost stayed lost. They didn't have the infrastructure to replace anything bigger than a destroyer. It's another one of the reasons why they wanted to keep all of those ships in port as a fleet in being, to serve as a potential threat to keep the Royal Navy tied down.
Yeah. I mean, to just illustrate how even the more technologically apt sites, radar sets differences can play a big role. It's the Battle of the Surigao Strait in 1944.
Oh,
when basically
Jesse
when some of the US battleships were able to really blind fire at long range and very precisely land hits on the Japanese, but some of them were able to get off only a few salvos or did not fire at all because they had fire control radar, but they didn't have the newest set, so they couldn't really blind fire. They still needed optical tracking for correction of fire, and they just couldn't see targets.
And the difference in installation times between some of those ships was maybe 6 to 8 months.
Yep.
Jesse
So
Oldendorf's battle wagons at that battle. I don't know if you've read The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors. I hope everybody here has, and you too in chat. They were saying that the radar operators on some of those battleships the radars were so finely tuned that they could actually visibly observe on the radar screen the Japanese battleships taking the hits. That's how precise the radar was.
Yeah. We have here a question from Tyran17, which I have to admit I don't know the answer to, so I hope that some of you do. Did the experience gained by the use of the Ark Royal in conducting airstrikes against the French fleet at Merthyr Kebir influence how the British planned and carried out the Battle of Taranto? If so, how?
Well, they were both similar attacks in the respect that they were both attacks on fleets moored in a shallow harbour, but one was a daytime attack and one was a nighttime attack. So there's a limited amount of experience that you can gain from that, but it's not the same.
I'm not even
It
sure
gives you
were
more experience in
torpedoes used
flying and
there?
dropping torpedoes for the
Yeah.
pilots, which of course then means they can, if it's not the same pilots involved in the Taranto operation, they can at least disseminate that information and lessons learned through the fleet. But it's not, they weren't sort of looking over their notes from the Merthyr Kebir attack and going, oh, well, they did this, this, and this, therefore we should do this, this, and this.
Plus,
Yeah.
one side knew the attack was coming, and in the other battle, they kind of didn't, which also influences your tactics.
Yes, and we also have a question that Juno has been asking actually since the beginning of the stream, so I wanted to read it out. He's wondering about the Italian damage control. How good was it, or was it bad? How was it compared to like the Japanese damage control?
I don't know specifically. I know how bad Japanese damage control was. I suspect that Italian damage control was probably severely lacking, and I only base that on. Again, going back to the Battle of Cape Matapan, I forget exactly which Italian heavy cruiser it was that was hit and severely damaged, and a couple of destroyers were sent back to attempt to help them out. And rather than sorting out the damage, the crew had broken into the wine store and all gotten drunk. Based on that, they were literally rolling around the upper deck drunk in the middle of the aftermath of a battle. And based on that, I'm going to say that they probably didn't take damage control as seriously as, for example, the Royal Navy or the US Navy.
That would be the crew of Polar. Yeah,
Thank you.
It tended to vary somewhat on a ship by ship basis.
Yeah.
Weirdly enough, the Matapan is actually an example of both extremes, because you've got Polar, which is, the Royal Navy shows up in the middle of the night to find, as Jingle said, that most of the crew are basically put themselves out of action. A bunch of them actually jumped into the sea before the Royal Navy showed up, just because they saw the flashes and explosions elsewhere, then had to be brought back onto the ship by their crewmates, because it turned out it wasn't quite time to sink yet. But on the other hand, you also have the crew of Vittorio Veneto, which earlier during the day had taken a torpedo hit to the stern, blew off one of its propellers. That potentially could have sunk the ship, because it's a very delicate area to get hit in. They had about 4,000 tons of water aboard, but they stopped the ship. They pumped out some water. They rebalanced the ship, flooding some other compartments deliberately to even out the list. And they managed to get Vittorio Veneto gradually back up to speed again and get it home. Now, bearing in mind that that is pretty much the same kind of hit that would do in Prince of Wales about 6 to 8 months down the line, that's actually a remarkable feat of damage control. The main difference being that they didn't try and restart the propeller shaft that had been hit, which was what did in Prince of Wales. And you see this again in other circumstances. In some battles, Italian ships get hit, and everyone thinks, "Oh, they're done for. Switch fire to another target," and the ship creeps away and lives to fight another day because the crew work really, really hard, and they manage to save the ship. In other cases, the first sign of an explosion, and suddenly half the crew have disappeared over the side because they're convinced they're all going to die. So it's difficult to say Italian Navy as a whole. It's more kind of, well, this ship's really good. This ship is frankly an embarrassment.
It
I think
probably really
it's
depended
safe
on the
to
captain.
say that at an institutional level, there was no damage control culture. But at individual ship levels, it depended entirely on how serious the captain of that ship was and how well he trained his crew, because he was getting no support from higher up.
We have a question from Icarus666 on Twitch. Why couldn't the Axis have taken Gibraltar and sealed the Mediterranean?
One does not simply take the rock.
Yes.
It's the rock. The clue's in the name. Yes, it was fairly heavily defended. And how are you going to take it? You know, there's Germany, France, Spain. Yes, Franco was a fascist nation, sympathetic to Germany, but didn't want to get involved in the war. So how are you going to take the rock? I mean, first you have to get there, and hello, Royal Navy and Royal Air Force, and then when you get there, it's the rock. I mean, good luck.
Yeah, this is the thing that neither the Kriegsmarine nor the Marine have any aircraft carriers, so you have no air support. You've got Force H waiting there, who would dearly, dearly love you to sail some troop transports into the Straits of Gibraltar, where you cannot maneuver. And then as you said, was like, well, if by some miracle you fight your way past Force H and the submarines don't get you, and the mines don't get you, and the motor torpedo boats don't get you, and Force H's aircraft don't get you, and the aircraft base at Gibraltar don't get you, then the three guys in a lifeboat who make it to the shore find themselves with a solid lump of granite and limestone that's covered in guns.
Although, you know, you could say the same thing about Singapore. And,
Yeah.
So never say never.
Yeah, but yeah,
unlikely.
basically, the only way how to take the rock would be from Spain, and I mean, Spain probably knew that their islands in the Atlantic are not really that well defended, and that I believe there was even some plan to actually occupy one of them by the British before they switched their aim to Iceland, right?
You know, Franco was basically looking at everything and going, well,
Let's see this one
Portugal
out.
is sympathetic to the Allies, and Portugal's not very sympathetic to Spain generally for most of its history. So they dearly love to take a few disputed territories back off of us if we go to war with the Allies. And then looking at Germany and Italy going, right, so you've declared, well, let's see, you've declared war on Britain, you've declared war on France, you've declared war on Russia, you've declared war on the United States. I sympathize with your politics, but good luck with that. We'll see how that goes.
We don't want to be on your side, actually.
Yeah.
I think you might have bitten off a little bit more than you can chew.
Absolutely.
There is a question on YouTube from Zapluna. I hope I read the name correctly, if not, sorry. How much did it affect the success of Deutsche Afrika Korps that the Italians lost the control of the Mediterranean to allies? A lot.
Oh, yeah, enormously. Who was it? I don't think it was Rommel himself, but possibly his chief of staff, whose name I cannot remember, who said right at the start, if we don't take Malta, we cannot win in North Africa. Because of Malta's position. It just interdicted everything. Yeah. All up the submarines were sorting from Malta. Yeah, I mean, it was just everything that went to North Africa had to go past Malta.
I think it
absolutely
wasn't
key.
I think it definitely wasn't Rommel, because for him logistics was something that happened to other people.
Yeah. Logistics was something he blamed on other people.
One of the successes of the Italian Navy is that they do manage to keep the Deutsche Afrika Korps supplied to a certain extent. The Royal Navy is doing its level best to make sure those convoys do not get through, and fair enough, a lot of them don't.
But enough of them get through to keep Rommel in the war.
Yeah, and if more of them had gotten through, then obviously it would have made life a lot easier, because he would have had more tanks, more fuel, more men, more supplies, more everything. But yeah, with it, the Royal Navy was able to take out enough of them, but at the same time, you can't really call it a failure on the Italians' part, because we've gone over all the problems from fuel to leadership, etc. the Italians had. So given that they were facing off against the Royal Navy, which was considerably larger than them, and the Kriegsmarine was very gradually being whittled down, so the Royal Navy could focus more and more effort on the Mediterranean, they did a pretty good job.
They definitely don't get enough credit for the logistics supply that they did manage to get through to Tripoli and Benghazi.
Especially considering that by late 1942, they basically were in very, very hard situation, especially at night, because basically not only the convoys were defenseless, but the convoys escorts were defenseless.
Because they didn't even, they're sending the convoys over without escorts by 1942, because because they just didn't have the escorts, or they said they didn't have the fuel for the escorts. That was the thing, because it was costing so much fuel to send the fuel over. You were running into the same kind of problems that, pretty much everybody experiences once they get to the end of their supply line. Happened to both us and the Germans and Italians in North Africa. It happened to the Germans in Russia. It happened to the Allies in Normandy, where at some point you need to take another port or get a railway line or something, because you're using more fuel to move the fuel to the front line than you're actually transporting. So we're running into all kinds of problems.
Yeah. I think in the realities of the North African campaign, it took 5 times more fuel to actually get the fuel to the front line than you can get there. That's.
Kilobin
I mean,
has
that's
an
why.
interesting. Oh, sorry.
So I was just going to quickly say, because that's why when you look at the names of the battles in North Africa, like the Battle of El Alamein, the Battle of Tobruk, the Battle of Benghazi, with very few exceptions, the battles are normally named after a place where there's a port or a railway station.
Yes.
Because controlling territory in North Africa is completely meaningless. Oh, I've got 500 more square miles of worthless desert than you do. Fantastic.
Yeah. It's
controlling the points of logistics.
It's basically telling that every time the Axis advance petered out, it was at about the same place. It was the last trailhead on a railway from Alexandria to the west. So that was basically the place where the Allies had all the supplies they needed right at hand, and where conversely the Axis troops had basically nothing.
Yes, so Kilobin asked a question here about Malta. Had the Malta floating dock not been scuttled, would the Royal Navy have committed a KGV or two to the Mediterranean post-Bismarck?
I can't answer that one. Malta floating dock? Is he referring to Malta as the island itself being a floating dock? Or is
there was a big floating dry dock.
Okay, that I know nothing about, so I'm going to have to hand that one over to you.
I don't think so, to be perfectly honest, because if you look at the King George V, so you've got King George V and Prince of Wales. Okay, Bismarck's taken out. Prince of Wales needs repairs, so you're down to King George V only. Tirpitz, Scharnhorst, and Gneisenau are still around. They're all fast. Like Rodney, yes, it can kill any of them in a straight-up fight. Can't catch them. And well, Hood's gone. You don't really want to send Renown or Repulse after. You can send Renown and Repulse after one of the Scharnhorst. You can't really send it after Tirpitz. So you need King George V, and once it's repaired, Prince of Wales, and as it comes online, Duke of York, to counter the German heavy ships. And then, of course, Prince of Wales goes off and gets itself sunk at the end of 1941. So you're down to Duke of York and King George V, and you need both to get a guarantee that one of them is going to be around on call at any time. And by the time Anson and Howe, the last two, are brought into service and commissioned, the struggle for the Mediterranean is pretty much over.
Plus, basically, basing any battleship on Malta would mean basing it very close to Italian airfields and basically subjecting it to the same slow torture that the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were subjected to in French ports. Like, basically a steady diet of bombs which, once in a time, hit and damage something, and basically you end up repairing the battleship all the time. Yeah,
if they were going to... let's say, if Prince of Wales didn't go off into Force Z, and they had King George V, Prince of Wales, and Duke of York, they might have deployed a King George V to the Mediterranean theatre, but it almost certainly would have been in Force H, because then it could have been pulled back into the Atlantic at very short notice.
Yeah. There is actually a very very good comment from Rifle 5733 on Twitch. Important point: the Axis-controlled ports had relatively small cargo offloading capabilities. The ports in Africa, and that's also true. There are recorded cases of the Italian cargo ships actually having to wait for days, even for up to 2 weeks, before even they got a place in the port to unload. So that's also not helping in your logistical effort.
This is why Tripoli was such a key point in the back and forth campaign in the desert, because it's one of the larger ports Well, it was one of the larger ports before
Yes.
multiple sieges reduced most of it to rubble.
Yeah, but even then, it had a limited capacity, and it couldn't unload the entire convoy at once, which
No.
kind of sucks. And there is a similar question from, similar themed question from Kasperina. I know Italy experimented with cargo submarines during World War II. What is your guys' opinion on that idea?
Far too limited capacity to have any meaningful difference to the outcome. Yeah, great. But you use cargo submarines for transporting extremely high value goods, not bulk supplies like fuel, food, ammunition, things like that. For that, you need massive bulk capacity, and submarines were never going to be able to do that.
Which is especially important for the military cargo because, like, I know that when people hear about tanks and guns, they imagine something heavy, and they are kind of heavy, but in terms of shipping, they are light, but they eat a lot of space, both deck space and cubic space.
If you've got an atom bomb part that you absolutely definitely need to get to New Mexico, you send it by submarine. But if you've got a load of tank fuel, you send it in a tanker, not a submarine.
Yes.
Yeah, so cargo submarines are good for transferring technology, for transferring plans and blueprints. The Germans and the Japanese did this quite a number of times, but even then that was fairly risky. That's another one of the big what ifs. Very early on in the war, there's a Japanese submarine that's loaded up with plans for flak veerlings, 88mm guns, Tiger tanks, radar, acoustic homing torpedo components, which you can imagine the Japanese would have rather appreciated. It makes it to Japanese-held Singapore, doesn't offload anything, keeps going to Japan, and gets itself sunk. So if anyone wants a few copies of mid-war German technology, go and find wherever that thing's gone down. But realistically, unless you're transferring technology, like, I don't know, say a long lance torpedo or something over to the German side, the only other thing you really want to be transporting is things like rare metals, because obviously Germany had a big shortage of tungsten towards the end of the war. You could probably get enough tungsten or other of the rarer metals in a submarine to last you for a little while. But one, you've got to find someone who's willing to sell you a submarine's worth of tungsten, which is getting very, very difficult.
Portugal.
and then your submarine has to survive because, it's more survivable than a cargo ship, but a cargo ship full of tungsten running up the English Channel has a survival rating in the latter part of World War II of precisely nothing. So just because it's more survivable doesn't mean it's guaranteed.
Cosmoflanker on YouTube chat seems to have caught what you did, Jingles. To New Mexico by submarine.
Don't know what you mean.
If you dig a tunnel.
The Germans transported some U-boats over land.
Exactly, there you go. See, I'm an expert. It says so. I'm a professional.
And the Japanese tried the cargo submarines to supply the Guadalcanal garrison, and didn't really work that well.
But much better success with the Tokyo Express. Outfitting destroyers for the same thing. Yeah. But again,
still
limited
not
because
enough.
They could only do it at night. And we're getting seriously off topic here, though, aren't we?
Well, but our time is also slowly running out. So.
It's a good time to go off topic.
Yes.
We also have a question here from Gneisenau, who's asking how effective the Royal Navy Aviation was in terms of airspace defense or camp duties against incoming airstrikes to the fleet.
I'm going to go with probably not very, purely because of the number of fighter aircraft that they carried, which was like maybe 2 or 3 or 4. They relied more on anti-aircraft guns, radar detecting the aircraft coming in, and building the carriers strong enough to take a couple of hits, as well as escorts out there putting an anti-aircraft screen up. We've covered this sort of thing in the past. The Royal Navy built their carriers the way they did because of where they were operating. The North Atlantic convoy routes in the Mediterranean, where you were always going to be in range of land-based aircraft, and you couldn't hope to not come under air attack. Unlike in the Pacific, where you've got the biggest ocean in the world to hide in, so you don't have to worry about armoring your flight deck as much, which restricts the number of aircraft that you can carry. Instead, you go with lots and lots of aircraft, long-range aircraft, get them out, massive big search patterns, spot anybody coming miles away, find the enemy fleet with your aircraft. You couldn't do that in the Mediterranean because most of the time there was no enemy fleet, and their fighters and bombers were always going to, or probably always going to find you. So you had to count on being able to take hits. So you built your carriers armored, and so on and so on.
Okay, I don't know how much is this question serious, but the Dravdager 99 is asking on Twitch, why does it say Drachenifel is in the bath? Is this a joke?
He is in the bath. You wonder why the camera only catches it from the chest down.
I am always at sea. It's no. That's because I am not in fact in Bath. I am in fact in southwest London. But no, Bath is a city in the UK, and for whatever reason, my IP seems to think that I am. My ISP seems to think I am in Bath. I can guarantee you, I am in fact not.
Wasn't it named Bath because there were some famous Roman baths there?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
There
I've
you
been
go.
and seen
It's a
them.
very, very old city.
Unfortunately, they don't let you in them anymore, apart from to look. Although, to be fair, the water is a rather weird shade of green, so I'm not necessarily sure I want
not
to go
not
in.
too tempting. Yeah.
No.
I guess this might be the last on-topic question for today from Lonely Locomotive on YouTube. How would you think? What would you think would have happened if the Kriegsmarine battleships have been in the Mediterranean to aid the Italian navy? Well, generally,
I
more
think they would have been
battleships
sunk.
means more battleships means more fuel consumption, and you need to get them there.
Yeah.
I
They've
think
gotta
the
go
British would
past
object.
The Rock.
Yes. You got to get
Good
past
luck.
Force H in the first place.
Yeah.
But at that point, you'd end up almost like in a situation like the German fleet was in Norway, where they sent out a big expedition, and they're like, well, that's 4 to 5 months worth of fuel build-up all burnt. So would have been a very powerful force, probably could put to sea once.
Yeah.
Yep.
Because don't forget, but almost every time the German Navy sortied during World War II, it was with the objective of getting out into the Atlantic, doing some damage, and not being seen until they were in a position to do the damage.
Yes.
How are you going to get past Gibraltar? I mean, we've seen Das Boot.
Mhm.
Jürgen Prochnow barely made it, and he was in a submarine. How are you going to do that in the Bismarck, the Tirpitz, the Scharnhorst?
Well, you crawl along the bottom.
By the way, Jingles, we have to fix this. It does boat.
That's fair enough.
Oh, I'm very sorry.
And to be perfectly
happy
fair,
to help.
if the Germans had put all their capital ships together and gone, right, we're going to sail into the Mediterranean, I actually have a feeling the Royal Navy might have ordered Force H to sail out of the way and let them through. Because then every single enemy capital ship is in one nice, neat place, which is exactly what the Royal Navy wants, because then instead of having to have the Mediterranean fleet, Force H, a home fleet, etc., etc., it's like, well, you're all there. Great. Now we can bring all those battleships we were having on convoy escort duty, all the ones we have out in Scapa Flow, because there's no actual major capital ship threat left in the North Sea or the Atlantic. And now now you see Force H will have King George V's and Rodney and Nelson, and plenty of recon flights just waiting for them to come out.
Yep.
And once the Americans get involved in the war, they'll be like, yes, well, we can recreate the 6th Battle Squadron if you want to send over a few South Dakota class, get in on the fun.
Yeah. So I think actually, our time is generally over. So we will probably slowly start wrapping things up. I would like to thank Dr. Alexander Clark for his remarks in the YouTube chat. I wasn't able to react on nearly all of them, but if you head to YouTube chat, there are some very interesting tidbits of information about the Italian carriers and other things in the reactions. And it's been fun reading them as they scrolled on the screen. We actually already have a topic for the next Armchair Admirals.
Yes,
and
we do.
it will be very closely tied to this installment of the Armchair Admirals, because basically, even in the questions, we have gone over who did really pay attention to the how and what of the raid on Taranto. So yes, the Japanese, and in the next installment we will be talking about how they utilize this knowledge. So the topic for the next Armchair Admirals will be the Pearl Harbor.
Yes, we had a ton of questions about this today, so we will be trying to answer even more about this in the next episode. And if you're wondering, like, hey, how can I actually get questions in, especially before the stream is actually happening, to have a higher chance of getting your question answered, the best way to do this is every time, a week before we're going to be having the next Armchair Admirals episode, which is usually on the last Friday in the month. We put in a little link for the forums where you can just, add your question already a week in advance, and we can also have some time to prepare the answers for your questions, because obviously it takes quite a bit of time to research all of this and give you the best possible answer. So if you're interested in, getting your question answered, my piece of advice is next time, read the publication and drop your question already in advance into that, and then otherwise you can always ask questions here on the fly, but we can only answer so many during the 2 hours that we have here and cover the entire topic. So I will already say goodbye and thank you everybody for watching, and leave the last words to our guests who were so nice to join us here and provide all of the knowledge and insights into naval history.
That's right. Remember, if I say it, it must be true. I'm a professional.
Yes, just the trust level is for this at least much higher than your spotting capabilities. It's funny, guys. So if you missed it, I'm still dropping the bonus code for the mission.
Yes,
your Jingles commander in chat, and I
we
still
sank a friendly submarine. What?
I still get questioned about this. Like, I really like the Jingles commander, but can you please fix him?
I saw that. Yeah.
And no, this is working as intended.
Working as intended.
Yes.
Exactly. So yeah, thank you very much to Jingles and Rachinifel. If you actually want to learn more about naval history, I can recommend both of these channels to find out more about history, naval history, and also just entertainment if you're looking for that on these channels. So go and hit that follow and subscribe button for both of the channels. And we'll be back next month with the topic of Pearl Harbor. And I hope it's going to be as interesting as this one, because I learned a lot today. And how Chad, you did too.
If you do like the Little Fleet Air Arm poster there, since it does prominently feature a swordfish, which we've gone over at length, you can get your own A4 version.
Nice.
I have about 200 of them.
So how do you get this?
Basically, go any of my videos. Look in the video description, and somewhere down in the video description, there's a link to an Etsy shop, and yeah, the A4 version of the poster is available there. There was some A3 ones as well, but they've all sold out.
Perfect. So you can find here on the screen where you can find Drachinifel's channel. Go check him out. For the Mighty Jingles, the easiest way to get to his channel, because I didn't edit today because he's the new kitchen owner, is you just go to Google and type in the Mighty Jingles, and it will be the first hit that you will find on the internet on YouTube, and you can find a lot of interesting videos there as well.
Yeah, just make sure you don't click on the second, third, fourth, fifth, because there's some very interesting stuff in all of the subsequent links that pop up on Google when you type my name in. And none of them are true.
And you're also going to show off your new kitchen, right? And skills that you acquired.
True.
Yes,
I do have a second
culinary
channel up
skills.
now, yeah.
This is the time to plug it if you want to.
Yeah, that reminds me, I need to, once we're finished here, I need to get to work on the lasagna that I'm doing, which is going to take 3 days to prepare, and then the bolognese, which we're going to be having
Damn, now
tomorrow.
I'm hungry.
Yeah, that sounds very, very, very yummy. And I'm only slightly hungry because it's now 10 p.m. and I didn't get to eat dinner yet. So that will be my next step, by trying not to get caught by the police here in Prague, because we have an official curfew.
Yes.
And I'm only allowed to be outside because I was at work until
exactly. If you are returning from work, it's allowed. So we are covered here, but I wonder if I will be stopped, or if Mr. Chrysanthos will be stopped.
Yeah. Okay, guys. Then thank you very much. and we will talk next month. Chat, I hope you enjoyed it, and we will be seeing you soon. If you want to, see us again, we're always going to be here on Thursdays from 6 to 8 Central European time. And with that, I'll say goodbye.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for watching. Taki, any last words from you?
Yep.
No?
Thank you for watching, and see you next month. I hope you had fun, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care. Have a nice weekend.